Sometimes life breaks your heart so many times you stop believing it will ever heal again. Sometimes you give up on love entirely, convinced that happiness was meant for other people, not for souls like yours who've known too much disappointment. In Deadwood Gulch, 1886, Matilda Boone sweeps her general store each morning, 34 broken promises weighing heavy on her shoulders. Barrett Clay tends his cattle alone, 13 years of grief carved deep into his weathered face. Then one dusty afternoon, he walks into her store and changes everything with 8 simple words. Maybe God's been keeping us for each other. But can two people who've lost faith in love find the courage to try one more time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boardwalk of Deadwood Gulch as Matilda Boone unlocked the heavy oak door of her general store. The brass bell above the entrance gave its familiar kimia sound that had marked the rhythm of her days for nearly 15 years now, ever since her father's passing left her sole proprietor of Boone's Mercantile. At 39, Tilly moved with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to depend entirely upon herself. Her auburn hair, though streaked now with premature silver, was pinned back in a neat chignon that never seemed to come undone, no matter how busy her day became. She wore a simple brown wool dress, practical and well-mended, with an apron that bore the honest stains of commerce flour dust, ink smudges, and the occasional splash of pickle brine from the large barrel near the counter. The store itself reflected her methodical nature. Every shelf was precisely arranged, every item in its designated place. Bolts of fabric stood at attention like colorful soldiers, their edges aligned with military precision. Glass jars filled with penny candy caught the morning light, creating small rainbows that danced across the polished wooden counter. The air carried the mingled scents of leather goods, dried herbs, coffee beans, and the faint sweetness of the handmade soaps she ordered from a widow in the next county. Behind the counter, hanging on a wooden peg near the cash drawer, was Barrett Clay's wedding ring. Not on display, few customers would notice it there, but present nonetheless, suspended on a thin gold chain he'd left behind after one of his visits. Tilly had meant to return it several times, but somehow the moment never seemed right. The simple gold band had become as much a fixture of her daily routine as checking the till or sweeping the front steps. The townspeople of Deadwood Gulch treated Tilly with a mixture of respect and gentle pity that she had grown accustomed to over the years. They valued her fairness in business, her willingness to extend credit during hard times, and her uncanny ability to order exactly what someone needed just before they realized they needed it. But underneath their practical appreciation lay an unspoken acknowledgement of what everyone referred to as Tilly's situation. 34 proposals. 34 times a man had gotten down on one knee, spoken words of love and commitment, and then for reasons as varied as the men themselves found cause to change his mind. The reasons had ranged from the practical to the absurd. Young Thomas Whitmore had decided she was too educated for a farmer's wife. Middle-aged banker Harold Creech determined that her independent spirit might interfere with his political aspirations. Most recently, traveling salesman Jonathan Pike had courted her for 3 months, before announcing that his mother back in St. Louis would never approve of a woman in trade. Each rejection had been a small death, a piece of her heart carefully folded away until she'd learned to keep her feelings locked in a drawer as secure as the one where she stored her father's old ledger books. The townspeople had watched this gradual retreat with the same helpless concern they might show for a favorite horse, slowly going lame, wishing they could help, but knowing some injuries simply had to heal on their own, if they ever healed at all. "Morning, Miss Tilly." The voice belonged to young Billy Henderson, barely 16 and already taller than his father. He touched the brim of his hat with the careful politeness that mothers in Deadwood Gulch drilled into their sons. "Ma sent me for a pound of sugar and some of that vanilla extract you got in last week." "Your mother's making her famous cake again?" Tilly asked, reaching for the sugar sack with practiced ease. "Must be someone's birthday." "No, ma'am," Billy said, shuffling his feet against the wooden floor. "She's making it for the new preacher. Says a good cake is the best way to welcome a man of God to town." Tilly measured the sugar carefully, her hands steady despite the familiar pang that always came with talk of welcoming new men to town. "I'm sure Reverend Morrison will appreciate the kindness." As Billy headed for the door, sugar and vanilla safely wrapped in brown paper, he paused. "Miss Tilly, Ma also wanted me to tell you that if you ever want to come to Sunday dinner again, you're always welcome. She says the house feels empty without your conversation." The invitation was genuine. Martha Henderson had been extending it monthly for the past 2 years, but Tilly had learned to decline gracefully. Sunday dinners in Deadwood Gulch inevitably involved well-meaning attempts at matchmaking, and she had endured enough of those awkward encounters to last several lifetimes. "Please tell your mother I appreciate the thought," Tilly replied with a gentle smile, "but Sundays are my day for inventory and catching up on the books." After Billy left, Tilly settled into the familiar routine of her morning preparations. She checked the coffee supply, always running low, as the men who gathered on her front porch each morning seemed to consume it faster than she could order it. She arranged the day's newspapers, noting the headlines about railroad expansion and mining disputes. She wound the old clock that had belonged to her father, its steady tick marking time, with the same reliability she had come to embody. It was during this quiet morning ritual that she noticed the rider approaching down Main Street. Even from a distance, Barrett Clay was unmistakable. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it, his broad shoulders set against a backdrop of morning sky. His hair, once dark as coffee grounds, now showed silver at the temples that caught the early sunlight, like threads of precious metal woven through darker fabric. Barrett Clay was something of a contradiction in Deadwood Gulch. His reputation as a former gunslinger preceded him stories of quick draws and deadly accuracy that belonged more to dime novels than to respectable conversation. Yet for the past 13 years, he had been nothing more than a successful cattle rancher, a man who kept to himself and his land with the dedication of someone seeking redemption through honest work. His ranch, the Circle C, sprawled across some of the finest grazing land in the territory. He ran it with quiet efficiency, employing 12 men and maintaining a herd that was the envy of neighboring ranchers. But despite his success and the respect it had gradually earned him, Barrett remained essentially alone. He came to town for supplies, attended church on Sundays, and participated in community gatherings when civic duty demanded it. Beyond that, he kept his own counsel. The townspeople had long since stopped trying to draw him into their social circles. There had been attempts in his early years invitations to dances, suggestions that he might find companionship with one of the available women in town or the surrounding area. But Barrett had politely and firmly declined all such overtures. His dedication to the memory of his late wife was both admired and, in its own way, pitied. 13 years was a long time for any man to remain alone, especially one still vital and capable of providing well for a family. As Barrett dismounted outside her store, Tilly found herself straightening her apron and smoothing back an imaginary stray hair. He was one of her most reliable customers, appearing every 2 weeks with a list written in his careful, precise handwriting. He never haggled over prices, always paid in cash, and treated her with the same courteous respect he showed everyone in town. Their interactions were brief, professional, and entirely predictable. The bell above the door announced his entrance, and Tilly looked up from her inventory sheets with what she hoped was her usual composed expression. "Good morning, Mr. Clay." "Miss Boone." He touched the brim of his hat in greeting, then moved toward the coffee display with his customary directness. Barrett Clay was not a man who wasted time with small talk, a trait that Tilly had come to appreciate in contrast to some of her more talkative customers. She watched him select a bag of coffee beans, noting the way he tested the seal with experienced fingers. Everything about Barrett suggested competence and careful consideration. His clothes were well-maintained, but practical denim pants that showed honest wear, a cotton shirt that had been mended neatly at one elbow, boots that were polished but not fancy. He carried himself like a man comfortable with his place in the world, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it. "Will there be anything else today?" Tilly asked, as he approached the counter with his selection. Barrett set the coffee down with deliberate care, then reached into his vest pocket for the folded paper that contained his list. But instead of consulting it, he looked directly at her with grey eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated weight of his solitary years. "Miss Boone," he said in his measured way, "I have a question that's been on my mind for some time now." Tilly felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Questions from men often led to complications, and she had learned to be wary of them. "Of course, Mr. Clay. How can I help you?" "It's not about supplies," he said, and something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. "It's about something more personal." The store suddenly felt very quiet, as if even the dust motes dancing in the morning sunlight had paused to listen. Tilly gripped the edge of the counter, preparing herself for whatever awkwardness was about to unfold. Barrett reached up and touched the chain around his neck, where she now noticed his wedding ring hung like a talisman against his chest. The gesture seemed unconscious, a habit formed over years of carrying that precious burden. "Miss Boone," he said quietly, "you've been rejected 34 times, and I haven't had a wife for 13 years. Maybe God's been keeping us for each other." The words hung in the air between them like something solid and real, more substantial than any of the merchandise surrounding them. Tilly felt her carefully constructed composure crack like ice under sudden pressure. This was not a question about fabric or flour or the price of lampwick. This was Barrett Clay, the most solitary man in Deadwood Gulch, suggesting that their respective loneliness might somehow equal companionship. "Mr. Clay," she began, but found she had no words to follow his name. "I'm not asking for an answer right now," he continued with the same calm directness he brought to everything else. "I'm just asking you to think about it. Two people who understand disappointment might understand each other." He placed the exact change for the coffee on the counter, touched his hat brim again, and walked toward the door. Just before stepping outside, he turned back. "Good day, Miss Boone. I'll be in town again next week." The bell chimed his departure, leaving Tilly alone with the echo of the most unexpected words she had ever heard. She stood frozen behind her counter, one hand still gripping its familiar edge, as the implications of what had just occurred slowly settled over her like dust after a windstorm. Outside, she could hear Barrett mounting his horse and the steady clip of hooves as he rode away. Inside, the store resumed its normal rhythm, the clock ticking, a floorboard creaking as she shifted her weight, the distant sound of morning activity beginning in the town. But something fundamental had changed in the space of those few minutes. Barrett Clay had looked at her accumulated rejections, not as evidence of some fundamental flaw, but as proof of her availability for something better. He had acknowledged his own long grief not as a barrier to new love, but as preparation for appreciating it. 34 rejections and 13 years of widowhood, Barrett's quiet arithmetic, these painful subtractions, somehow added up to possibility. Tilly reached under the counter and pulled out the small hand mirror she kept there for checking her appearance during busy days. The face that looked back at her was the same one that had been declined 34 times, but for the first time in years, she found herself wondering what Barrett Clay saw when he looked at it. The morning customers would begin arriving soon, and she would need to compose herself for the familiar routine of commerce and conversation. But as she tucked the mirror away and straightened her apron once more, Matilda Boone found herself considering a possibility she had not entertained in a very long time. Perhaps her story was not ending after all. Perhaps, at 39, with silver threading through her hair and caution threading through her heart, she was simply arriving at a different chapterone, written not by the young woman who had believed love would come easily, but by the mature woman who had learned its true value through its absence. The daguerreotype on Barrett Clay's mantelpiece had watched over his solitary meals for 13 years. Sarah's face, captured in sepia tones and housed in an ornate silver frame, smiled with the eternal youth of the departed. Her eyes seemed to follow him as he moved through the modest parlor of his ranch house, and more than once he had found himself explaining his daily decisions to that unchanging portrait. "I spoke to Miss Boone today," he said to the photograph that evening, settling into his leather chair with a cup of coffee that had grown cold during his ride home. "Said something I've been thinking about for months now." The house around him bore the careful maintenance of a man with too much time and too little purpose beyond survival. Every surface was clean, every object in its proper place, but there was an emptiness that no amount of tidiness could fill. The rooms echoed with the absence of conversation, of laughter, of the thousand small sounds that make a house into a home. Barrett had built this life carefully, deliberately, as a monument to his grief. Each day followed the same pattern: rise before dawn, check the cattle, work the land, return to this shrine of solitude. It was a life that honored Sarah's memory through its very stillness, its refusal to move forward into anything that might diminish what they had shared. But lately, the silence had begun to feel less like reverence and more like stagnation. At 52, Barrett Clay was still a vital man with useful years ahead of him. His body remained strong from physical labor, his mind sharp from the complexities of running a successful ranch. Yet he had been living as if he were already buried beside his wife, under the cottonwood tree that marked her grave. "She wouldn't want this," he admitted to the portrait, speaking aloud the thought he had been trying to suppress for months. Sarah was never one for wallowing. The truth was that Sarah had been the most practical woman he had ever known. She had married him despite his reputation as a gunslinger, had followed him to this remote territory without complaint, had built their home and their happiness through sheer force of will and determination. If she could see him now, she would likely have some sharp words about a man wasting his life in devotion to the dead. The memory of Matilda Boone's shocked expression brought something that might have been a smile to his weathered features. He had surprised himself as much as her with his direct approach. Barrett Clay was not typically given to grand gestures or romantic declarations, but standing in her store, watching the careful way she conducted her business, observing the quiet dignity with which she faced each day despite her accumulated disappointments, something had shifted inside him. Tilly Boone was not Sarah would never be Sarahan. That was perhaps exactly what he needed. She was a woman who had learned to stand alone without becoming bitter, who had faced rejection without losing her capacity for kindness. There was a strength in her that complemented his own, a resilience born of different trials but equally tested. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in the small apartment above her store, Tilly sat before her own evening ritual. The faded wedding dress hanging in her back room had been her mother's, carefully preserved and occasionally aired out in the hope that someday it might serve its intended purpose. Tonight, for the first time in years, she found herself actually considering that possibility. The dress was yellowed with age and would need considerable alteration. Her mother had been a smaller woman, but the basic structure remained sound. The bodice was intricate lacework, the skirt full enough to be fashionable even by current standards. Looking at it now, Tilly tried to imagine herself standing before Barrett Clay in that dress, speaking vows that had been spoken by 34 other couples while she watched from the congregation. "Don't be foolish," she told herself firmly, but the words lacked conviction. Barrett's proposal had awakened something she thought long dead, not just hope, but a kind of practical curiosity about what their life together might look like. The next morning brought the predictable parade of interested townspeople to her store. News traveled fast in Deadwood Gulch, and Barrett's unusual visit had not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Henderson arrived first, under the transparent pretense of needing thread that Tilly was certain she already possessed in abundance. "I hope you don't mind my asking, dear." Martha Henderson began with the careful diplomacy of a woman accustomed to extracting information. "But folks are saying Barrett Clay seemed quite purposeful in his visit yesterday." Tilly continued arranging the ribbon display with studied concentration. "Mr. Clay is always purposeful, Mrs. Henderson. It's one of his defining characteristics." "Oh, certainly. Martha agreed quickly, but purposeful in a different way. More personal, perhaps? Before Tilly could respond, the store door opened to admit Dr. Williams, whose medical practice gave him both social standing and an excuse to be anywhere in town at any time. He was followed closely by Mayor Patterson, who had never met a conversation he couldn't join uninvited. "Morning, Miss Tilly," Dr. Williams said with the hearty cheerfulness he reserved for delicate situations. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Perfect weather for new beginnings." Mayor Patterson nodded sagely. Indeed, sometimes a man reaches a point where he realizes that being alone isn't the same as being strong. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of indirect communication. No one mentioned Barrett's name directly, but everyone present understood exactly who and what they were discussing. Mrs. Henderson worried about certain people taking advantage of other people's generous natures. Dr. Williams pontificated about the health benefits of companionship for individuals of a certain age. Mayor Patterson offered observations about the stability that marriage brought to the community as a whole. Through it all, Tilly maintained the polite smile she had perfected over years of similar conversations. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle well-meaning interference was to acknowledge it without encouraging it. "I appreciate everyone's concern," she said finally, her tone gentle but firm. "But I believe that matters of the heart are best left to the individuals involved." After her visitors departed, Tilly found herself alone with the weight of expectation that now seemed to fill every corner of her store. The entire town would be watching to see what she did with Barrett's proposal. Some would be hoping for romance, others preparing for disappointment. All would have opinions about her choice. That evening, as she locked up the store and climbed the stairs to her apartment, Tilly made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would not be rushed into anything, but neither would she dismiss Barrett's proposal out of hand. He had asked her to think about it, and that was exactly what she intended to do. She pulled her father's old accounting ledger from its shelf and opened it to a blank page. If she was going to consider this properly, she would approach it with the same methodical care she brought to her business decisions. On one side of the page, she wrote, "Reasons to consider marriage." On the other, "Reasons to decline." The second list was easier to populate. Fear of another rejection topped it, followed by the comfort of her established independence, the potential complications of merging two well-ordered lives, and the simple fact that she barely knew Barrett beyond their brief commercial interactions. The first list required more thought. Barrett was clearly a man of substance. His ranch was prosperous, his reputation solid. He had shown her respect rather than pity, had acknowledged her situation without treating it as a failure. Most importantly, his own long widowhood suggested he understood the value of commitment. As she sat there, pen poised over paper, Tilly realized that her real fear was not of Barrett himself, but of hope. Each of her previous rejections had begun with hope, and each disappointment had been more difficult to bear than the last. At 39, she had finally achieved a kind of peace with her solitude. Barrett's proposal threatened to upset that carefully maintained equilibrium. But as she looked around her, small apartment clean, orderly, and profoundly quiet, Tilly found herself wondering if peace was really enough. She had spent so many years protecting herself from disappointment that she had forgotten what it felt like to anticipate joy. Barrett had given her a week to consider his proposal. As she closed the ledger and prepared for bed, Tilly realized she had already made more progress toward a decision than she had expected. Tomorrow she would begin the delicate process of getting to know Barrett Clay as something more than a customer. For the first time in 13 years, Barrett Clay's house felt different when he returned from town. The silence seemed less complete, the emptiness less absolute. Sarah's portrait still watched from the mantelpiece, but now it seemed to regard him with something approaching approval. He had set something in motion that could not be undone, and the thought filled him with equal measures of anticipation and terror. For 13 years, his life had been predictable, controlled, safe. Now he had introduced an element of uncertainty that would either destroy his carefully maintained peace or transform it into something he had almost forgotten how to imagine. As he settled into his evening routine, Barrett found himself making small changes without conscious thought. He lit an extra lamp in the parlor, opened a window to let in the evening air, even hummed a tune he hadn't remembered knowing. The house seemed to exhale, as if it too had been holding its breath for 13 years. Sarah's portrait caught the lamplight and seemed to flicker with life. For just a moment, Barrett could almost hear her voice, warm with the practical wisdom that had first drawn him to her. "About time," she seemed to say. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how to live." The hand-carved wooden music box sat on a dusty shelf in Barrett's bedroom, forgotten among other relics of his former life. He had made it during the long winter evenings of his first year of marriage, whittling away at the pine, while Sarah mended clothes by lamplight. The melody it played was simple, beautiful dreamer, but Sarah had hummed along every time he wound the tiny mechanism. After her death, the music had become unbearable. The box had been relegated to increasingly remote corners of the house until it finally came to rest on that bedroom shelf, silent and gathering dust like so many other remnants of happiness. Barrett hadn't opened it in over a decade, but as he prepared for his second visit to Tilly's store, he found himself reaching for it with hands that trembled slightly. The mechanism still worked, though it protested with tiny squeaks and hesitations. The melody emerged haltingly, like a half-remembered prayer, and Barrett listened to the entire song before closing the lid with gentle finality. Perhaps it was time to remember that he had once been a man capable of creating beautiful things for the woman he loved. His reflection in the mirror showed the same weathered face that had regarded him for 13 years, but something in his expression had changed. There was a tension around his eyes, a straightness to his shoulders that suggested purpose beyond mere survival. He had asked Matilda Boone to consider his proposal, and now he found himself considering what manner of man he wished to be if she said yes. The second visit to the store required more courage than the first. Barrett had made his initial proposal on impulse, driven by a sudden clarity that had surprised him as much as her. Now he was embarking on the more complex work of courtship, a dance he had not attempted in over 20 years and had never performed with a woman who had reason to be wary of men's promises. Tilly was restocking the shelves when he entered, her movements efficient and graceful despite the awkwardness that seemed to settle over them both like morning mist. She looked up at the sound of the bell and offered him a careful smile that revealed nothing of her thoughts. "Good morning, Mr. Clay. Your usual supplies?" "Among other things," Barrett replied, removing his hat with deliberate courtesy. "I was hoping we might have a chance to talk." The store was empty except for them, but Tilly glanced toward the windows as if expecting an audience to materialize. In a town the size of Deadwood Gulch, privacy was a luxury that required careful planning. "Perhaps you'd join me for coffee on Sunday after church?" Barrett suggested. "We could walk down by Willow Creek. It's peaceful there, and we'd have a chance to speak without interruption." Tilly's hands stilled on the bolt of fabric she was arranging. "That would be appropriate," she said finally, and Barrett noted the careful way she chose her words. "I believe a conversation would be beneficial for us both." Their first real conversation took place 3 days later on a wooden bench Barrett had built years earlier near the creek's edge. He had come here often during the darkest period of his grief, finding solace in the water's steady murmur and the way sunlight filtered through the willow branches. Today, the setting felt like a beginning rather than a refuge. Tilly sat with her hands folded in her lap, wearing her best Sunday dresser deep blue wool that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. She had taken particular care with her appearance, Barrett noticed, though she seemed determined to maintain the composed demeanor that had served her through 34 disappointments. "I imagine you have questions," Barrett said, settling beside her with careful attention to proper distance, "about my proposal, about my intentions, about what I might expect from such an arrangement." "I do," Tilly admitted, "though I'm not certain I know how to ask them without seeming indelicate." Barrett smiled at her honesty. "Perhaps we might start with the practical matters. Those are often easier to navigate than the personal ones. Very well. Tilly turned slightly to face him, her expression serious. If we were to marry, what would become of my store? It would remain yours, Barrett replied without hesitation. I have no interest in trade beyond what's necessary for the ranch. Your business is a testament to your capability. I wouldn't presume to interfere with something you've built so successfully. And your ranch would benefit from having a woman's touch in the house again, Barrett said carefully, but I wouldn't expect you to abandon your own responsibilities. We would need to find a balance that honors both our commitments. They spoke for over an hour about the logistics of merging two established lives. Barrett described his daily routines, the seasonal demands of cattle ranching, the men who worked for him and their families. Tilly shared the challenges of running a business that served the entire community, the irregular hours, the need to maintain good relationships with suppliers in distant cities. As the conversation progressed, Barrett found himself studying Tilly's face with new attention. She listened with the same careful focus she brought to business dealings, asking practical questions and offering thoughtful observations. There was an intelligence in her responses that he had always sensed, but never fully appreciated during their brief commercial interactions. May I ask you something personal? Tilly said as their discussion wound toward its natural conclusion. Of course. What changed your mind about remaining alone? After 13 years, something must have made you reconsider. Barrett was quiet for a long moment, watching the creek flow past their feet. I realized I was no longer honoring Sarah's memory, I was hiding behind it. She was a woman who believed in moving forward, in making the most of whatever time we're given. I think she would be disappointed to know I've spent 13 years standing still. And why me? The question was asked quietly, but Barrett heard the vulnerability beneath it. After 34 rejections, I have to wonder what you see that others have missed. I see a woman who has been tested and proven strong, Barrett replied. Someone who has faced disappointment without becoming bitter, who has maintained her dignity and her capacity for kindness, despite good reason to become cynical. I see someone who understands that love is not a game for children, but a serious undertaking that requires maturity and commitment. Tilly's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and she turned away to compose herself. I had not considered that my difficulties might be seen as qualifications rather than failures. The right man wouldn't see them as failures at all, Barrett said gently. He would see them as evidence that you haven't settled for less than you deserve. As they walked back toward town, their conversation turned to lighter matters. Barrett shared stories of his ranch hands' personalities and quirks, the ongoing battle with coyotes, the satisfaction of watching his herd thrive under his careful management. Tilly described her more colorful customers, the challenge of predicting what the community would need, the small victories of helping families through difficult times. By the time they reached the edge of town, both had begun to relax into the rhythm of genuine conversation. The formal politeness that had characterized their interactions was giving way to something more natural, more promising. I would like to continue these conversations, Barrett said as they paused at the corner where their paths would diverge. If you're amenable to the idea. I am, Tilly replied, and her smile held more warmth than he had ever seen from her. Perhaps next Sunday we might walk a different direction. I'd like to see your ranch, if that wouldn't be inappropriate. It would be my pleasure to show you around, Barrett said, touching his hat brim in farewell. I think you'd appreciate what we've built there. That evening, Barrett sat in his parlor with Sarah's portrait, regarding him from the mantelpiece. For the first time in years, he found himself speaking to it with something approaching hope rather than mere habit. I think you'd like her, he said softly. She has your strength, though she's come by it differently, and she listens the way you always did, not just to words, but to what's behind them. The music box sat on the table beside his chair, silent, but somehow less forgotten than it had been that morning. Perhaps soon he would find the courage to share its melody with someone new, to remember that he had once been a man who created beautiful things, not just for preservation, but for joy. Tilly's father's ledger book had been her constant companion since inheriting the store. its pages filled with 15 years of careful entries in his neat, precise handwriting. Each transaction was recorded with methodical accuracy, every debt and payment tracked with the dedication of a man who understood that a general store was more than a business. It was the economic heartbeat of a community. As she prepared for her visit to Barrett's ranch, Tilly found herself turning through those familiar pages, remembering her father's voice explaining the delicate balance between profit and service that kept a small-town business alive. "People need to trust you with more than their money," he had told her. "They need to trust you with their dignity when times are hard and their gratitude when times are good." That philosophy had shaped every aspect of how she conducted business, but it had also shaped how she approached relationships. The same caution that made her extend credit wisely made her guard her heart carefully. Her father's practical nature had been both blessing and burden, teaching her to be self-sufficient, while perhaps making her too wary of depending on others. The ledger contained more than business records. It held the story of Deadwood Gulch itself. She could trace the town's prosperity through the varying amounts spent on luxury items, could mark hard winters by the increase in credit extended, could see families grow through their changing needs for children's clothing and school supplies. Her father had built the store to serve this community, and she had continued that mission with quiet determination. But now, as she closed the ledger and prepared to see Barrett's ranch, Tilly found herself wondering if there might be room in her carefully ordered life for something beyond duty and service. Her father had been a widower too, had raised her alone after her mother's death when Tilly was 12. Perhaps he would have understood the loneliness that had gradually settled over her life like dust on unused furniture. The ride to Barrett's ranch was her first time leaving town in over 2 years. He had offered to escort her, but she had insisted on driving her own small buggy, a gesture of independence that he had accepted with understanding rather than offense. The road wound through rolling grassland that stretched toward distant mountains, and Tilly found herself marveling at the vastness of the territory Barrett called home. The Circle C ranch house sat on a slight rise, overlooking grazing land that seemed to extend to the horizon. It was larger than she had expected, a 2-story structure built from local timber and stone, with a wide porch that spoke of evenings spent watching the sunset. The building was well maintained, but clearly the domain of a man living alone. It lacked the small touches that made a house welcoming rather than merely functional. "Built it myself, mostly," Barrett said, as he helped her down from the buggy. "Sarah designed the layout, but I did the carpentry work during our first winter here. Kept us busy when the snow was too deep for much outdoor work." The tour he gave her was thorough and honest, pointing out both the house's strengths and its shortcomings. The kitchen was spacious but outdated, the parlor comfortable but sparsely furnished. Sarah's presence was still evident in the careful arrangement of furniture and the quality of fabrics she had chosen, but 13 years of bachelor living had gradually worn away the finer details that had once made it a true home. "I imagine it feels quite large for one person," Tilly observed as they stood in what had clearly been intended as a family dining room. "It does," Barrett admitted. "I eat most of my meals in the kitchen now. This room hasn't been used for its intended purpose since." He paused, then continued with characteristic directness, "Since Sarah died." Tilly ran her hand along the polished surface of the dining table, noting the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. "Did you make this as well?" "I did. Sarah wanted something that would seat 8 people comfortably. She had hopes for a large family." Barrett's voice held no bitterness, but Tilly heard the weight of unfulfilled dreams in his words. They moved through the house methodically, Barrett explaining the practical aspects of ranch life, the early hours demanded by livestock, the seasonal rhythms of breeding and calving, the constant vigilance required to protect the herd from predators and disease. Tilly listened with the focused attention she brought to all new information, asking questions that revealed her quick understanding of the challenges involved. "You'd need to learn to ride properly," Barrett said as they walked toward the barn. "The distances out here are too great for walking, and there are times when a buggy isn't practical." "I rode as a child," Tilly replied, though I imagine ranch horses require different skills than the gentle mare my father kept for deliveries. The barn was Barrett's pride, clearly designed by someone who understood horses and cattle with intimate knowledge. The stalls were spacious and well ventilated, the hayloft efficiently organized, the equipment maintained with the same meticulous care he brought to everything else. Several ranch hands were working nearby, and they touched their hats respectfully when Barrett introduced Tilly as Miss Boone from town. "The men seem devoted to you," Tilly observed as they continued their tour. "I pay fair wages and treat them with respect," Barrett replied. "Most of them have been with me for several years. They're good men who work hard and ask for little beyond honest employment." As the afternoon progressed, Tilly began to understand the scope of what Barrett had built. The ranch was not just a business but a complete world unto itself, requiring skills and knowledge she was only beginning to appreciate. Yet she found herself drawn to its rhythms, to the sense of purpose that permeated every aspect of the operation. "What do you think?" Barrett asked as they sat on the porch steps, watching his cattle graze in the distance. "Does it seem like something you could be part of?" Tilly considered her words carefully. "It's impressive what you've accomplished here, and I can see why you find satisfaction in this kind of work. But I wonder how my store would fit into this life. The responsibilities seem quite demanding." "They are," Barrett agreed, "but they're not constant. There are busy seasons and quiet ones, just like any business. During the busy times, you might need to rely more heavily on help in the store. During the quiet ones, you'd have more freedom to focus on your own work. And you would truly not expect me to abandon the store entirely." "Miss Boone, Tilly, I've watched you run that business for years. You've built something valuable that serves this entire community. I'd be a fool to ask you to give up something you've worked so hard to create." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep in Tilly's heart. None of her previous suitors had understood that the store was more than just a means of supporting herself. It was her life's work, her contribution to the community. Her father's legacy continued through her own efforts. As they drove back toward town in the gathering dusk, Tilly found herself imagining what it would be like to divide her time between the store and the ranch, to have two worlds instead of one small apartment above a business. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying, requiring changes she wasn't certain she was ready to make. "Thank you for showing me your home," she said as Barrett helped her down from the buggy outside her store. "It's given me much to consider." "I hope those considerations are favorable," Barrett replied with a slight smile. "I find myself increasingly hopeful about the possibility of sharing that home with someone who would appreciate what we've built there." That night, Tilly sat with her father's ledger open before her, but instead of recording the day's transactions, she found herself writing something entirely different. For the first time since Barrett's proposal, she began to imagine what a different kind of life might look like, one that honored her father's memory while allowing room for new growth. The practical considerations were complex, but not insurmountable. The emotional considerations were more difficult to evaluate, requiring her to weigh the safety of her current solitude against the risk of hoping for happiness once again. But as she closed the ledger and prepared for bed, Tilly realized that Barrett Clay had shown her something she had almost forgotten existed. The possibility of a partnership built on mutual respect rather than mere romantic sentiment. Perhaps that was enough foundation on which to build something lasting. The silver locket had been Tilly's mother's most treasured possession, and now it rested in Tilly's jewelry box like a talisman of hope deferred. Inside the delicate oval case was a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, young faces filled with the confidence of people who believed love would conquer all obstacles. Her mother wore the same dress that now hung in Tilly's back room, and her father's expression held a tenderness that Tilly remembered from her childhood before grief had carved lines around his eyes. As she fastened the locket around her neck for the first time in years, Tilly found herself thinking about the conversation she needed to have with Barrett. 3 weeks of careful courtship had led to this moment, the moment when they would need to decide whether their growing friendship could become something more permanent. Barrett had been patient with her methodical approach to their relationship, understanding that a woman who had been disappointed 34 times would need more than romantic gestures to convince her of his sincerity. Instead, he had offered something far more valuable: consistency. He had arrived at her store every Tuesday and Friday at precisely 2 o'clock, had taken her for walks along routes that became familiar through repetition, had answered her questions about ranch life with the same straightforward honesty he brought to all their conversations. The engagement announcement, when it finally came, was delivered with characteristic simplicity during their 4th Sunday walk together. They had been discussing the practical arrangements for combining their households when Barrett stopped walking and turned to face her with the careful deliberation she had learned to recognize as his way of approaching important matters. "Tilly," he said, using her given name with the ease that had developed over their weeks of conversation, "I believe we've talked around this subject long enough. Will you marry me?" The question was direct, unadorned by flowery speeches or dramatic gestures, and Tilly found that she appreciated its honesty. Barrett Clay was offering her a partnership based on mutual respect and practical compatibility, seasoned with the possibility of deeper affection growing over time. "Yes," she replied, with equal simplicity. "I believe we would make a good match." The kiss that sealed their engagement was gentle, tentative, a question as much as a declaration. Neither of them was young enough to mistake passion for permanence, but both were mature enough to recognize the value of genuine connection. News of their engagement spread through Deadwood Gulch with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. By Monday morning, Tilly's store was filled with well-wishers, curiosity seekers, and the inevitable few who seemed disappointed that the town's most famous spinster would no longer provide a source of sympathetic speculation. Mrs. Henderson arrived with a basket of fresh bread and barely contained excitement. "Oh, my dear, I'm so pleased for you both. Barrett Clay is a good man, and it's high time he had someone to share that big house with." Dr. Williams offered his congratulations with professional satisfaction. "Marriage is excellent for one's constitution, Miss Boone. I expect to see a marked improvement in both your health and Mr. Clay's once you're settled." Mayor Patterson pontificated about the stabilizing influence of marriage on the community, while several younger women in town regarded Tilly with new interest, as if her success might provide a template for their own romantic aspirations. But not all reactions were positive. Eleanor Fairchild, whose own matrimonial ambitions had been thwarted by advancing age and a sharp tongue, sniffed audibly when she heard the news. "Well," she said to anyone who would listen, "I suppose some people are willing to settle for any offer that comes along. Though I can't imagine what a successful rancher sees in a woman who's been passed over so many times." Such comments stung, but Tilly had long ago developed armor against the casual cruelties of small-town gossip. Barrett, however, proved to have less patience for criticism of his bride-to-be. "I heard what Eleanor Fairchild said about you," he told Tilly during one of their evening conversations. "If she speaks that way again, I'll have words with her." "Please don't," Tilly replied quickly. "Eleanor's tongue is sharper than her mind. Responding to her would only give her more ammunition. I don't like hearing you spoken of disrespectfully." The protective note in his voice warmed Tilly more than any romantic declaration might have. Barrett Clay was a man who would defend what he valued, and knowing that she had joined that small circle brought a security she had never experienced before. Their wedding planning was conducted with the same practical efficiency they brought to everything else. Tilly chose to be married in her mother's dress, though it required extensive alterations. Barrett arranged for the ceremony to be held in the small church where he had attended services alone for 13 years. They selected a date 6 weeks in the future, enough time to make necessary preparations without allowing room for doubts to multiply. The challenge came not from their own uncertainties, but from Barrett's adult children. James Clay arrived from Denver 3 weeks before the wedding, tall and stern-faced like his father, but lacking Barrett's hard-won wisdom. At 28, he had built a successful law practice and a firm conviction that his father was making a mistake. "She's too old to give you more children," he said bluntly during a tense dinner at the ranch house. "And what do you really know about her character? 34 rejections suggest something's wrong with her." "James." Barrett's voice carried a warning that his son ignored. "I'm thinking of your welfare, Father. You've been alone so long that any companionship probably seems appealing, but marriage is a permanent arrangement, and you barely know this woman." Elizabeth Clay Morrison, Barrett's daughter, arrived from California with similar concerns, though expressed with greater tact. At 26, she had inherited her mother's diplomatic nature along with her beauty, but her opposition to the marriage was no less firm than her brother's. "I'm not against your happiness, Papa," she said during a private conversation. "But why marriage? Why not simply enjoy Miss Boone's friendship without the legal complications?" "Because I'm not interested in friendship alone," Barrett replied with patience that was beginning to fray. "I'm 50, 2 years old, and I've spent 13 years living like a dead man. Your mother would be ashamed of the life I've made since she died." "Don't speak for Mother," Elizabeth said sharply. "She loved you completely. How can you replace her with someone who's essentially a stranger?" The accusations and arguments wore on Barrett in ways that Tilly could see despite his attempts to shield her from the family discord. His children's visits left him drained and defensive, struggling between his love for them and his determination to build a new life. For Tilly, the opposition was both hurtful and familiar. She had faced skepticism before, though never from people whose opinions would matter so much to her future husband. The knowledge that Barrett's children saw her as an opportunist and a poor substitute for their beloved mother reopened wounds she thought had healed. "Perhaps we should postpone the wedding," she suggested one evening, when Barrett's exhaustion was particularly evident, "until your children have had more time to accept the idea." "No," Barrett said firmly. "I've wasted enough years accommodating other people's opinions about how I should live my life. James and Elizabeth will learn to accept our marriage, or they'll learn to stay away. But I won't let their disapproval dictate my choices." The silver locket felt heavy against Tilly's chest as she considered the challenges ahead. Her parents had faced opposition to her mother's family, had disapproved of her father's modest prospects, but they had overcome it through the strength of their love and their commitment to each other. Perhaps that was the key. Not to expect Barrett's children to welcome her immediately, but to build something so strong and genuine that their opposition would eventually crumble before its reality. The locket held the memory of one successful marriage built on love and determination. Perhaps it could witness another. Barrett's old Colt revolver lay in a locked wooden box beneath his bed, wrapped in oiled cloth like a relic from another life. The weapon had once been an extension of his hand, as familiar as breathing and twice as deadly. During his years as a hired gun, that Colt had earned him a reputation that still preceded him in certain circles. Though most residents of Deadwood Gulch knew him only as a successful rancher who preferred solitude to socializing. The gun represented everything he had tried to leave behind when he married Sarah and settled into respectability. She had never asked him to abandon that life. Sarah was too wise to demand what could not be freely given, but her presence had made the choice easy. Love had been stronger than violence, hope more compelling than the cold satisfaction of being faster than other men who lived by their guns. Now, 3 weeks before his wedding to Tilly, the past was threatening to intrude on his carefully constructed peace. Word had reached town that Marcus Devlin was asking questions about Barrett Clay's whereabouts, and old-timers who remembered the stories were beginning to look at Barrett with the mixture of fascination and fear that had once been as familiar as his own shadow. Tom Henderson, the ranch foreman who had worked for Barrett for 8 years, brought the news during their weekly meeting to discuss herd management and seasonal planning. Tom was a steady man in his 40s, not given to dramatics, which made his obvious concern all the more troubling. "Boss, I hate to bring this up with your wedding so close, but there's been talk in the saloons," Tom said, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his weathered hands. "Fellow came through last week asking about you. Used your old name, the one from before." Barrett felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the instinctive alertness that had kept him alive during his years as a gunfighter. What did he look like? Young, maybe 25, dark hair, expensive clothes, carried himself like he knew how to use the iron on his hip, said his name was Devlin. The name hit Barrett like a physical blow. Marcus Devlin was the son of Jake Devlin, a man Barrett had killed in self-defense 12 years ago during his final gunfight. The boy had been 13 then, old enough to remember and young enough to nurse grievances into obsessions. What did you tell him? Nothing, Tom replied firmly. Told him we don't discuss the boss's business with strangers, but he's been asking around town too. Sooner or later, someone's going to point him toward the ranch or Miss Tilly's store. Barrett closed his eyes and felt the weight of 13 years of peace threatening to crumble. He had known this day might come, had always known that his past could not be buried as easily as Sarah had been. But he had hoped to have more time, to be able to face whatever reckoning awaited him as a married man with something solid to defend, rather than a solitary figure with nothing left to lose. "There's more, boss," Tom continued reluctantly. "Some of the men are getting nervous. They know your reputation from the old days, and they're worried about what might happen if this Devlin fellow decides to make trouble. Families to think about, you understand." Barrett understood all too well. The men who worked for him were good people who had signed on to tend cattle, not to become casualties in someone else's war. His past had no right to threaten their safety or their livelihoods. That evening, Barrett made the difficult decision to tell Tilly about the potential threat. She deserved to know what she might be marrying into, deserved the chance to withdraw her acceptance if the dangers outweighed her feelings for him. They met in her apartment above the store, a space that reflected her practical nature and quiet tastes. The furniture was simple but well maintained, the room clean and orderly without being stark. It was the home of a woman who had learned to find contentment in small pleasures and careful routines. "There's something I need to tell you," Barrett began, settling into the chair she indicated while she prepared coffee with the methodical care she brought to everything. "Something about my past that might affect our future." Tilly's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their task. "I assumed there would be complications eventually. Men don't become as solitary as you've been without reasons." Barrett told her about Marcus Devlin, about the gunfight with his father, about the young man's apparent quest for vengeance. He explained his reputation from the old days, the skills that had made him both feared and valuable in a territory where law was often enforced at gunpoint. "I killed 18 men during those years," he said quietly, watching her face for signs of disgust or fear. "All in fair fights, all in self-defense or in defense of others. But that doesn't make them any less dead. And it doesn't erase the fact that I was very good at something no man should take pride in." Tilly listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. When he finished, she poured coffee for both of them and settled into the chair across from his. "Do you think this young man means to challenge you to a duel?" she asked. "It's possible. Or he might simply want to cause trouble, to destroy what I've built here as revenge for his father's death. And if he challenges you—" Barrett met her eyes directly. "I would try to avoid it. I have no desire to kill another man, especially one driven by grief rather than malice. But if I had no choice, if he threatened you or innocent people, I would do what was necessary. Are you still fast enough?" The question surprised him with its practicality. Tilly wasn't asking whether violence was morally justifiable. She was assessing the tactical situation like a general planning a campaign. "I don't know," Barrett admitted. "It's been 12 years since I drew a gun in anger. I practice occasionally, keep my reflexes sharp for hunting and dealing with predators around the ranch, but facing another man with deadly intent that's different from shooting bottles or wolves." Tilly sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "What does your foreman recommend?" "Tom thinks I should send word to the territorial marshal, get official protection, but that would mean bringing more attention to the situation, possibly making things worse. And what do you think?" Barrett was quiet for a long moment, surprised to realize that her opinion mattered more to him than any tactical consideration. "I think I'm tired of running from my past. I've spent 13 years trying to be someone different, someone better. Maybe it's time to prove that the man I've become is stronger than the one I used to be." Then we'll face it together, Tilly said simply. Tilly, you don't understand the danger. I understand perfectly. Her voice was calm but firm. You're telling me that our wedding might attract trouble, that associating with you could put me at risk. You're giving me the opportunity to withdraw gracefully. I'm giving you the chance to protect yourself. And I'm telling you that I don't want protection if it means losing what we've built together. Tilly leaned forward slightly, her grey eyes steady on his. Barrett, I've spent 39 years being careful, being safe, protecting myself from disappointment and heartbreak. It's made me comfortable, but it hasn't made me happy. This is different from emotional risk. This is about physical danger. Yes, it is, and I'm still not walking away. She reached across the small table and touched his hand. We'll face whatever comes, just as married couples have always done. Together. That night, as Barrett rode back to his ranch under a star-filled sky, he felt the familiar weight of the old Colt beneath his bed calling to him. Perhaps it was time to clean and oil it, to remind his hands of skills he had hoped never to need again. But this time, he would not be preparing for his own survival alone. He would be defending something infinitely more precious, the possibility of happiness that Matilda Boone had brought into his carefully guarded life. The thought both terrified and strengthened him. For the first time in 12 years, Barrett Clay had something worth fighting for beyond mere existence. The burned letters were discovered by accident, tucked beneath loose floorboards in what had been Sarah's sewing room. Barrett had been making repairs to the house in preparation for bringing Tilly home as his bride, when one of the boards shifted under his weight, revealing a small cavity that Sarah had apparently used as a hiding place. The letters were charred around the edges, but still legible, tied with a ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to grey with age. Barrett's hands trembled as he recognized Sarah's handwriting on the first envelope, addressed to someone named David Carmichael in San Francisco. The postmark showed they had been written during the last year of her life, when Barrett thought their marriage had been entering its happiest phase. He almost didn't read them. 13 years of idealizing Sarah's memory had created a sanctuary in his heart that these letters threatened to desecrate. But as he sat in the room where she had spent countless hours mending clothes and humming softly to herself, Barrett felt compelled to learn what she had felt necessary to hide from him. The first letter shattered his carefully preserved illusions with devastating efficiency. "My dearest David," it began, "I cannot continue this charade much longer. Barrett is a good man who deserves better than a wife whose heart belongs to another. Every day I remain here feels like a betrayal of us both, but I am too much a coward to face the scandal my departure would cause." Barrett's vision blurred as he read her plans to leave him, her confession of love for a man she had known before their marriage, her struggle between duty and desire. The woman he had mourned for 13 years, the perfect wife whose memory had sustained him through loneliness and guided his choices, had been planning to abandon him for another man. The second letter was worse, detailing her pregnancy and her uncertainty about the child's parentage. The baby she had lost in her 7th month, the child Barrett, had grieved as deeply as he mourned. Sarah herself might not have been his at all. "I pray God will forgive me for the confusion I have caused," she had written. "If this child lives, I will tell Barrett the truth and ask his forgiveness. If it dies, perhaps I can find the courage to end this marriage before I cause more pain." The final letter was unfinished, breaking off mid-sentence as if interrupted by the sudden onset of labor that would ultimately claim both Sarah and the child. Barrett found it clutched in hands that no longer seemed to belong to him, his entire understanding of his past, rewritten by words written in a hand he had once cherished. For 13 years, he had lived as a shrine to their love, preserving their home and their memory with religious devotion. He had turned away from life because he believed nothing could equal what he and Sarah had shared. Now he learned that what they had shared had been, for her, a burden she was preparing to cast off. The discovery came just 5 days before his wedding to Tilly, at a time when he was already struggling with external threats and family opposition. Marcus Devlin was still asking questions around town. His children remained hostile to his remarriage. and the community was watching his every move, with the fascination of people observing a drama they hoped would provide entertainment. Barrett's first impulse was to saddle his horse and ride until Deadwood Gulch was nothing but a memory behind him. The revelation about Sarah made everything else seem pointless. If he had been so wrong about the woman, he thought he knew better than himself. How could he trust his feelings about Tilly? How could he expect happiness when his judgment had proven so fundamentally flawed? He spent the night walking through his house like a stranger, seeing 13 years of careful preservation in a new and bitter light. Every object he had maintained in Sarah's memory now seemed to mock him. The dining room table where she had planned meals while dreaming of another man. The bedroom where she had lain beside him while her heart belonged elsewhere. The kitchen where she had prepared food while planning her escape. When dawn came, Barrett found himself sitting on his front porch, with the letters scattered around him like the remnants of his former life. Tom Henderson arrived for their morning meeting and took one look at his employer's face before settling into the adjacent chair without speaking. "She was going to leave me," Barrett said finally, his voice hoarse from hours of silent anguish. "My wife, the woman I've been mourning for 13 years, was planning to run away with another man." Tom's weathered face showed no surprise, only the patient sadness of someone who had suspected uncomfortable truths. "Figured it might be something like that," he said quietly. "You knew?" "Not the details, but I've got eyes, boss. Woman who was really happy wouldn't have spent so much time writing letters she hid from her husband. And she got awful quiet that last year, stopped talking about the future the way she used to." The simple acceptance in Tom's voice was more devastating than shock would have been. Barrett realized that others had seen what he had chosen to ignore, had recognized signs of his wife's unhappiness that his idealization had obscured. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Barrett asked, gesturing toward the letters. "Everything I've believed about my life has been a lie." "Not everything," Tom replied. "You've built a good ranch, treated your people fair, earned respect through honest work. That's not a lie. And Miss Tilly, what you two have got between you, that's real too. How can I marry her now? How can I trust anything I feel when I was so wrong about Sarah?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, considering his words with the care of a man who understood the weight they would carry. "Boss, you ever think maybe the problem wasn't that you loved Sarah wrong, but that you tried to keep loving her after she was gone? Dead people can't disappoint you, can't change, can't turn out different than you remember. Makes them easy to worship, hard to replace." "I don't understand. Miss Tilly's alive. She's got her own thoughts, her own feelings, her own reasons for doing things. She's not perfect, and she's not trying to be. Maybe that's better than worshipping a ghost who was never as perfect as you needed her to be." Barrett stared across his land, watching cattle move slowly through morning pasture. For 13 years, this view had been filtered through the lens of loss, every sunrise a reminder of what he had lost. Now, for the first time, he tried to see it simply as what it was: successful ranch, a good life, a foundation for building something new. "I need to tell Tilly," he said eventually. "You thinking of calling off the wedding?" Barrett considered the question seriously. The revelation about Sarah changed everything about his past, but did it change anything about his future? Tilly had accepted his proposal knowing about his violent history, his family's opposition, the threat posed by Marcus Devlin. Would learning that his first marriage had been less perfect than advertised make her less willing to risk a second one? "I don't know," he admitted, "but she deserves to know the truth. If we're going to build something together, it has to be based on honesty, not on the fantasy I've been living." That afternoon, Barrett rode to town with the letters in his saddlebags and a heart heavier than it had been since Sarah's funeral. But beneath the pain and disillusionment, something else was stirring, a sense of liberation he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. For 13 years, he had been living up to an impossible standard, trying to honor a love that had never been as pure as he believed. Perhaps it was time to stop worshipping the past and start building a future based on reality rather than idealization. Perhaps Tilly deserved a husband who was fully present rather than one who divided his loyalty between the living and the dead. The burned letters had destroyed his illusions about Sarah, but they had also freed him from the obligation to live as a monument to her memory. For the first time since her death, Barrett Clay was truly available to love someone else, not as a replacement for perfection, but as a partner in the imperfect, honest, complicated business of building a life together. Whether Tilly would still want him once, she knew the truth remained to be seen, but Barrett was finally ready to find out. The wedding quilt had been Martha Henderson's idea, proposed during a gathering of the Church Ladies' Auxiliary with the enthusiasm of women who understood that community celebrations required community effort. Each family in Deadwood Gulch would contribute a square, creating a masterpiece that would serve as both wedding gift and symbol of the town's investment in Barrett and Tilly's union. "It's what we do for all our couples," Martha had explained to Tilly during one of her well-meaning visits to the store. "A quilt carries the love and prayers of the entire community. Every time you look at it, you'll remember that you're not just married to Barrett, you're part of all of us." The quilt squares had arrived steadily over the past month, each one reflecting the personality and skills of its creator. Mrs. Patterson had contributed an elaborate design featuring intertwined roses that must have taken weeks to complete. Young Billy Henderson's mother had sewn a simple but heartfelt square depicting a ranch house with carefully embroidered windows. Even Eleanor Fairchild, despite her earlier criticisms, had submitted a square with precise stitching and a geometric pattern that spoke to her exacting standards. Now, 3 days before the wedding, the completed quilt lay spread across the church's fellowship hall tables, a tapestry of goodwill that should have filled Tilly with warmth and gratitude. Instead, she stared at it with the hollow feeling of someone who might not deserve the faith it represented. Barrett had told her about the letters the previous evening, sitting in her apartment with the burned pages spread between them like evidence in a trial. His voice had remained steady as he read selected passages aloud, but Tilly had seen the devastation in his eyes, the way 13 years of carefully constructed meaning crumbled with each revealed word. "I thought you should know," he had concluded, gathering the letters with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. "Before you commit to marriage with me, you should understand that I was wrong about everything I thought I knew about love." Tilly had listened without interruption, her merchant's mind cataloguing the implications, while her heart ached for the pain she saw in his face. Barrett's discovery changed nothing about her feelings for him, but it clearly changed everything about his confidence in those feelings. "Do you want to call off the wedding?" she had asked quietly. "I don't know what I want anymore," Barrett had replied with devastating honesty. "How can I trust my judgment about us when I was so completely wrong about Sarah? How can I promise you a lifetime when I don't even understand the lifetime I've already lived?" That conversation had ended without resolution, Barrett departing with a promise to think more about their situation, and Tilly left alone with her own doubts and questions. Not about Barrett, she understood him better now than before, saw that his capacity for loyalty and devotion was real, even if it had been misdirected, but about whether she had the strength to help him heal from this devastating revelation. Now, standing before the community quilt that represented so much hope and expectation, Tilly felt the weight of dozens of families who had invested time and emotion in their success. The thought of disappointing them was almost as painful as the prospect of losing Barrett himself. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" The voice belonged to Reverend Morrison, the new preacher who would officiate their ceremony if it proceeded as planned. He was a kind man in his 50s, recently arrived from Kansas with a gentle manner that had quickly endeared him to the congregation. "It is," Tilly agreed, though her voice lacked conviction. "Mrs. Henderson tells me each square represents a prayer for your happiness. That's quite a blessing to begin a marriage with." "Reverend Morrison," Tilly said carefully, "may I speak with you privately about the ceremony?" They moved to his small office behind the sanctuary, a modest space that smelled of leather-bound books and lamp oil. Reverend Morrison poured tea from a pot that seemed perpetually ready for pastoral conversations, then settled behind his desk with the patient expression of someone accustomed to pre-wedding anxieties. What troubles you, Miss Boone? Tilly found herself reluctant to betray Barrett's confidence about the letters, but the Reverend's kind eyes encouraged honesty. Mr. Clay has recently learned some difficult truths about his first marriage, things that have shaken his confidence in his own judgment. Ah, Reverend Morrison nodded with understanding. The dead often become more perfect in memory than they ever were in life. Such discoveries can be painful but also liberating. He's questioning whether he should proceed with our wedding, whether he can trust his feelings for me when he was apparently so wrong about his feelings for his late wife. And what do you think? The question caught Tilly off guard. Throughout 34 previous courtships, no one had ever asked what she thought about the fundamental nature of love and commitment. Men had told her what they wanted, what they expected, what their plans were for their future together. But none had sought her opinion on the deeper questions that marriage represented. I think, she said slowly, that loving someone who's alive is completely different from loving someone who's dead. The dead can't disappoint us because they can't change. But they also can't surprise us with new kindness, can't grow alongside us, can't choose us again each day. That's very wise. Mr. Clay has spent 13 years loving a memory that turned out to be incomplete. But the man I know, the one who courted me with such careful respect, who worried about my welfare when danger threatened, who has treated me as an equal partner rather than a convenience, that man is real. His capacity for love is real. Have you told him this? Not in so many words. I think he needs to come to his own understanding before he can hear mine. Reverend Morrison smiled. You're a wise woman, Miss Boone. Marriage requires exactly that kind of patience and faith. Meanwhile, at the Circle C Ranch, Barrett was having his own conversation with Tom Henderson about the practical implications of calling off a wedding 3 days before it was scheduled to occur. The whole town's been preparing for weeks, Tom pointed out, as they checked the cattle in the south pasture. Mrs. Henderson's been cooking for 3 days straight. Old Pete Patterson's been polishing his fiddle for the dancing. You call this off now, you're going to disappoint a lot of people. Better to disappoint them now than after the marriage fails, Barrett replied, though his heart wasn't in the argument. You really think it would fail? Barrett considered the question seriously. His discovery about Sarah had shattered his confidence in many things, but not in his assessment of Tilly's character. She was exactly who she appeared to be: practical, honest, capable of standing by her commitments even when they became difficult. I don't know, he admitted, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm making the same mistake twice, seeing what I want to see instead of what's really there. Boss, with respect, I think you're thinking about this backward. How so? You spent 13 years loving a dead woman who couldn't love you back. Miss Tilly's alive, she's here, and she's choosing to marry you with her eyes wide open. She knows about your past as a gunfighter, knows about your difficult children, knows about the threats from young Devlin. She's not marrying some fantasy, she's marrying you, problems and all. The conversation continued as they rode the fence line, checking for damage and planning repairs. Tom's practical wisdom gradually wore away at Barrett's doubts, not by dismissing them, but by reframing them in terms of present reality rather than past illusions. That evening, Barrett found himself once again in his parlor, but instead of speaking to Sarah's portrait, he found himself looking at the future rather than the past. The house felt different now, not like a shrine to be preserved, but like a home to be lived in. The rooms that had echoed with loneliness for so long suddenly seemed to anticipate the sound of conversation, of shared meals, of two lives building something together. He pulled out writing materials and began composing a letter to Tilly, trying to capture thoughts that seemed too complex for spoken words. The letter grew to several pages as he worked through his feelings about Sarah's betrayal, his fears about repeating past mistakes, and his growing certainty that what he felt for Tilly was different from anything he had experienced before. I have been afraid, he wrote, that my judgment was so flawed regarding Sarah that I could not trust my feelings about you. But I realize now that the two situations are entirely different. I loved Sarah despite never really knowing her. I love you because I do know you, your strength, your kindness, your practical wisdom, your capacity for forgiveness. You are not a fantasy I have constructed, but a real woman I have come to respect and cherish." As he sealed the letter, Barrett felt a sense of resolution settling over him like peace after a storm. Tomorrow he would deliver it to Tilly, and together they would decide whether to proceed with a wedding that would mark not just the union of two lonely people, but the beginning of something built on truth rather than illusion. The community quilt would either cover their marriage bed as a symbol of new beginnings, or it would become a beautiful reminder of what might have been. But either way, Barrett Clay was finally ready to stop living in the past and begin building a future based on the reality of who he was and who he chose to love. In 3 days, the church bells would ring either for a wedding or for the Sunday service that would mark another week of solitary existence. Barrett found himself hoping, for the first time in years, that love would prove stronger than fear. The church bell began its steady tolling at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, calling the people of Deadwood Gulch to witness what many hoped would be the wedding of the year. The old bronze bell had rung for countless ceremonies over the past 20 years: baptisms, funerals, Sunday services, and the occasional wedding, but today its voice seemed to carry extra weight, as if it understood the significance of calling a community to celebrate love's triumph over long odds. Tilly stood before the mirror in the church's small anteroom, wearing her mother's wedding dress after weeks of careful alterations. The yellowed silk had been cleaned and pressed, the bodice taken in to accommodate her more slender frame, the train shortened to accommodate her practical nature. Despite its age, the dress retained an elegant simplicity that suited both the occasion and her personality. Martha Henderson fussed around her like a mother hen, adjusting the veil that had also belonged to Tilly's mother and ensuring every detail was perfect. "You look beautiful, dear," she said with tears threatening to spill over. "Your mother would be so proud." Through the small window, Tilly could see the church filling with townspeople dressed in their finest clothes. The entire community seemed to have turned out for the occasion: ranchers and shopkeepers, wives and children, even some of the cowboys from the outlying spreads who rarely ventured into town except for necessities. But despite the festive atmosphere outside, Tilly's heart was heavy with uncertainty. Barrett's letter had arrived yesterday evening, filled with words of love and commitment that should have reassured her completely. Instead, she found herself questioning whether he was proceeding with the wedding from genuine conviction or from obligation to the community's expectations. "Mrs. Henderson," Tilly said quietly, "has Mr. Clay arrived?" "Oh, yes, dear. He's been here for nearly an hour, pacing around the churchyard like a caged wolf. Poor man looks as nervous as you do." The description should have been comforting, but Tilly found herself wondering if Barrett's nervousness stemmed from anticipation or dread. The revelation about Sarah's intended betrayal had shaken him to his core, and while his letter had expressed determination to move forward, she couldn't shake the fear that he was forcing himself into a marriage he no longer truly wanted. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her anxious thoughts. Reverend Morrison's voice called softly, "Miss Boone, Mr. Clay would like a word with you before the ceremony, if you're amenable." Such a request was unusual but not unheard of, and Tilly found herself grateful for the opportunity to see Barrett's face before they stood at the altar. "Please tell him I'll meet him in the vestry." The vestry was a small room behind the sanctuary where the Reverend kept his ceremonial robes and the church's sacred vessels. Barrett stood by the single window, wearing a black suit that emphasized his tall frame and silver-touched hair. He looked handsome and distinguished, but Tilly could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control that suggested a man wrestling with profound doubts. "Tilly," he said, turning as she entered, "thank you for agreeing to see me." "Barrett." She closed the door behind her, creating a bubble of privacy in the midst of the community's celebration. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," he admitted with the honesty she had come to value above all his other qualities. "Not of marrying you, but of disappointing you, of proving that I'm not the man you deserve." "And what man do I deserve?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "One who knows his own heart, one who can promise you happiness without reservation." Tilly moved closer, studying his face with the careful attention she had learned to bring to important decisions. "Barrett, do you love me?" Yes. The answer came without hesitation, carrying a conviction that surprised them both. Do you respect me? Completely. Do you believe we could build a good life together? I do. But Tilly, what if I'm wrong again? What if I'm seeing what I want to see instead of what's really there? She reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of skin weathered by years of outdoor work. Then we'll discover that together. Love isn't about being certain of the future, it's about choosing to face uncertainty with someone you trust. I've made so many mistakes. So have I. 34 of them, by most people's count. But maybe those mistakes were preparing us for this moment, for each other. Barrett's hand covered hers where it rested against his cheek. I want this, Tilly. I want to marry you, to build something real and honest together. But I need you to know that I'm not the man I thought I was when I first proposed to you. Good, Tilly said with a small smile. Because I'm not the woman I thought I was either. I thought I was someone who would always choose safety over risk, who had given up on the possibility of love. But here I am, about to marry a former gunfighter who comes with dangerous enemies and difficult children, and I've never been more certain of anything in my life. The sound of the church bell tolling again reminded them that their community was waiting, that a decision needed to be made. Barrett straightened his shoulders and offered Tilly his arm. Shall we see if we can make this work? I think we already have, Tilly replied, taking his arm with a confidence that surprised her. Now we just need to make it official. As they prepared to face their future together, the church bell continued its steady call to witness not just a wedding, but the beginning of a love built on truth rather than illusion, on choice rather than desperation, on the mature understanding that happiness comes not from perfection, but from the courage to risk everything for the possibility of something real. The two simple gold wedding bands lay on the church's altar, catching the morning sunlight that streamed through the stained glass windows. Unlike the elaborate ring Barrett had worn for 13 years as a monument to his first marriage, these were plain, unadorned circles that spoke to practical commitment rather than romantic sentiment. Barrett had chosen them with Tilly's input, both understanding that their union required symbols unencumbered by the past. The church was filled to capacity, with latecomers standing along the walls and even a few faces pressed against the windows from outside. The entire population of Deadwood Gulch seemed determined to witness this unlikely romance reach its conclusion. Their presence a testament to the community's investment in the idea that love could triumph over long odds and patient waiting. Barrett stood at the altar with Reverend Morrison, his hands clasped behind his back to conceal their slight trembling. The revelation about Sarah's letters had changed everything about his understanding of his past, but it had also freed him to approach this moment without the burden of comparison. He was not trying to recreate what he had lost, he was creating something entirely new. When the church doors opened and Tilly appeared, a collective intake of breath rippled through the congregation. She moved down the aisle with the measured grace that had always characterized her actions, her father's prayer book clutched in her gloved hands, since she had no living relative to escort her. The independence that had once made suitors uncomfortable now seemed like strength, her solitary walk, a declaration that she was choosing this marriage freely rather than from desperation or convenience. As she reached the altar and turned to face Barrett, their eyes met with an understanding that transcended words. Both had come to this moment through paths of disappointment and loss, but both had also arrived with their capacity for hope intact. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Morrison began, his voice carrying easily through the packed church. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Barrett Clay and Matilda Boone in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, advisedly, and in the fear of God." The familiar words took on new meaning as Barrett listened, remembering his first wedding when he had been so young and certain of love's permanence. Now, at 52, he understood that love required choice as much as feeling, commitment as much as passion. When the Reverend asked if anyone present knew of any lawful impediment to their union, a tense silence filled the church. Barrett found himself half expecting Marcus Devlin to burst through the doors with accusations and challenges, but the moment passed peacefully. Whatever reckoning awaited him, it would not interrupt this ceremony. Barrett, Reverend Morrison continued, do you take Matilda to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? Barrett's voice was steady as he replied, I do. The words carried the weight of his full understanding not just of what he was promising, but of what promises meant when made by people who had learned their true cost. Matilda, do you take Barrett to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? Tilly's I do rang clear through the church, and Barrett saw in her eyes the same resolution he felt in his own heart. They were not children playing at love, but adults who had chosen each other with full knowledge of life's uncertainties and each other's imperfections. The ring ceremony brought the most profound moment of the service. As Barrett slipped the simple gold band onto Tilly's finger, he spoke the words that replaced 13 years of mourning with the promise of new beginnings. With this ring I thee wed, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. When Tilly placed his ring on his finger, Barrett felt the symbolic weight of removing Sarah's ring from around his neck, being replaced by something lighter but no less meaningful. This ring would not be a memorial to love lost, but a daily reminder of love chosen and renewed. By the power vested in me by the territory of Dakota and the grace of Almighty God, Reverend Morrison declared, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Barrett, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle, respectful, full of promise rather than passion. It spoke to the mature love they had built through honest conversation and practical consideration, a foundation that might prove more durable than the romantic fires that had burned so brightly in their youth. As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and cheers. Martha Henderson was openly weeping. Dr. Williams was beaming with professional satisfaction at having two patients whose health would undoubtedly improve through matrimony, and even Eleanor Fairchild was applauding with what might have been genuine pleasure. But Barrett and Tilly had eyes only for each other, their joined hands a symbol of the choice they had made to face whatever came next together. The community's celebration mattered, but it was secondary to the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had built something real and honest from the ashes of their individual disappointments. As they walked down the aisle together, Barrett caught sight of his children standing near the back of the church. James looked grudgingly accepting, while Elizabeth managed a small smile that suggested the beginning of reconciliation. Their presence felt like an unexpected gift, a sign that even the most strained relationships might heal with time and patience. The church bell tolled again as they emerged into the bright morning sunshine, but now its voice seemed to carry celebration rather than summons. Barrett and Tilly Clay had been joined not just in marriage, but in the understanding that love's greatest triumph comes not from avoiding life's difficulties, but from facing them with someone who shares your commitment to endure and grow together. The new family portrait sat on the mantelpiece where Sarah's photograph had once held solitary vigil, showing Barrett and Tilly standing together in front of what had become their shared enterprise. 6 months after their wedding, the image captured not just two people who had found love late in life, but a partnership that had transformed both their individual businesses and their understanding of what family could mean. The photograph had been taken by the traveling photographer who passed through Deadwood Gulch twice yearly, and it showed the Clay General Store and Ranch, the expanded operation that had grown from combining Tilly's mercantile expertise with Barrett's cattle business. Behind them in the image stood the store's new loading dock, built to accommodate the increased trade that came from ranchers throughout the territory, who trusted Barrett's judgment on livestock and Tilly's fair pricing on supplies. Barrett studied the photograph each morning as he drank his coffee, marveling at how different his life had become. The house that had echoed with loneliness for 13 years now hummed with the quiet activity of a marriage built on mutual respect and growing affection. Tilly had not tried to erase Sarah's memory entirely, but she had gradually transformed the space from a shrine to the past into a home for the future. The kitchen had been updated with new equipment that made meal preparation more efficient, allowing Tilly to manage both household duties and her continued oversight of the store. The dining room had been reopened for its intended purpose, hosting not just their daily meals but also business meetings with suppliers and neighboring ranchers who had come to value their combined expertise. Most significantly, the bedroom that had been Barrett's solitary domain for so long had become a place of shared comfort and growing intimacy. The music box he had carved for Sarah now sat on Tilly's dressing table, its melody no longer a source of pain, but a reminder that he was once again a man capable of creating beauty for the woman he loved. "Your wool gathering again," Tilly observed, as she entered the parlor with the morning mail, her tone carrying the gentle teasing that had become comfortable between them. 6 months of marriage had taught them both that love in middle age was different from young passion, steadier, more thoughtful, built on appreciation for each other's competence rather than idealization of perfection. "Just appreciating how much has changed," Barrett replied, making room for her on the settee they had purchased together to replace the single chair that had accommodated his years of solitude. "Most of it for the better, I hope." "All of it for the better." He reached for her hand, still marveling at how natural the gesture had become. Even the complications. The complications had indeed been numerous. Marcus Devlin had finally appeared 3 weeks after their wedding, young and angry, and determined to force Barrett into a gunfight that would avenge his father's death. But the confrontation that Barrett had dreaded proved anticlimactic when faced with the reality of a mature man who had built a life worth protecting rather than a solitary gunfighter with nothing left to lose. "I don't want to kill you, son," Barrett had told the young man with quiet conviction, "and I don't believe your father would have wanted you to die for his mistakes. But if you force this fight, one of us will die, and my wife will be widowed, and your mother will lose her son. Is that really the justice you're seeking?" The conversation that followed had lasted most of the afternoon, with Tilly providing coffee and quiet support, while Barrett shared the hard-won wisdom of a man who had lived through violence and found peace on the other side. When Marcus finally rode away, he carried with him not vengeance but understanding and Barrett's promise that if he ever wanted honest work, the Circle C would have a place for him. Barrett's children had presented a different but equally significant challenge. James had eventually come to respect Tilly's business acumen, particularly after she had helped him resolve a complicated contract dispute involving one of his client's mining claims. Elizabeth had taken longer to warm to her stepmother, but the birth of her second child had created an opportunity for Tilly to demonstrate the same practical kindness she brought to everything else in her life. "I never expected to be a grandmother at 40. Tilly had confided to Barrett after spending a week in California helping Elizabeth through a difficult recovery. "But I find I quite enjoy having family beyond just the two of us." The store had thrived under their combined management, with Barrett's connections throughout the ranching community bringing new customers, while Tilly's reputation for fair dealing kept them coming back. They had expanded the building to include a larger warehouse and had hired young Billy Henderson to help with deliveries and inventory management. More importantly, their marriage had become a source of inspiration for others in the community. 3 other late-in-life courtships had blossomed in Deadwood Gulch over the past 6 months, as if Barrett and Tilly's success had given permission for other lonely hearts to risk hoping again. "Mrs. Patterson told me yesterday that she's been writing to her childhood sweetheart back in Ohio," Tilly reported as she sorted through the mail. "Apparently he's been a widower for 2 years and has been too shy to contact her first." "Seems to be going around," Barrett observed with satisfaction. Tom Henderson mentioned that Dr. Williams has been paying considerable attention to the new schoolteacher. As evening approached, they sat together on the front porch that had been expanded to accommodate 2 rocking chairs and a small table for sharing the end-of-day coffee that had become their favorite ritual. The view stretched across land that now felt like home to both of them, the cattle in the near pasture, the town's lights beginning to twinkle in the distance, the vast sky that had witnessed their transformation from solitary individuals into a family. "Do you ever regret it?" Barrett asked quietly, a question that had become part of their evening conversations, not from doubt, but from the gratitude of people who understood how fortunate they had been. "Never," Tilly replied with the certainty that had grown stronger with each passing month. "Not the waiting, not the disappointments, not even the fear. All of it led us here." Barrett reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the music box, winding it carefully before setting it on the table between them. The melody of Beautiful Dreamer drifted across the evening air, no longer a reminder of loss, but a celebration of the beautiful dreams that sometimes, against all odds, came true for those patient enough to wait for real love rather than settling for its counterfeit. As the last notes faded into the prairie silence, Barrett and Tilly Clay sat in comfortable quiet, two hearts that had been broken by life's disappointments but had learned that healing was possible, that love could be stronger the second time around, and that sometimes the best dreams were those that came to people wise enough to appreciate their true value. In the distance, the church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the territory the same message it had proclaimed on their wedding day, that love, when built on truth and sustained by choice, could indeed triumph over any obstacle life might present.